My name is Gillian Vane. Last Tuesday afternoon, my 8-year-old daughter Maya returned from my sister-in-law Amber's estate wearing a strange pink bucket hat. She held the brim low, refusing to meet my eyes. When I lifted the canvas brim, her 14 inches of thick, coppery curls were completely gone, unevenly chopped close to the scalp. Above her right ear was a jagged 2-inch injury that had clearly been bleeding. In a plastic bag, she carried her severed braid. Auntie Amber said my hair ruined the visual symmetry of the portrait line, she whispered. When a multi-generational family network treats a child's natural traits as commercial inventory for a lifestyle brand, would you choose to maintain the peace to preserve your place at the table? Or would you start documenting the structural cracks to bring the system down? I did not execute an emotional outburst. When your formative youth is spent entirely within the boundaries of the state care system, you quickly learn that raw panic carries zero operational currency. It is an entirely useless expenditure of vital survival resources. Instead, I immediately activated my professional protocol, the identical, detached focus I deploy when verifying the shifting load-bearing parameters of a buckling historical building. I carried Maya to the master bathroom, quietly washed the low-country dirt and the dry, rust-brown crust from her upper ear with a sterile antiseptic gauze pad, and placed her in her bed with her preferred book about the forest foxes. I watched her small eyelids grow heavy under the soft glow of the lamp. The exact moment her respiration stabilized into a deep sleep cycle, I walked back down the long hallway and retrieved my encrypted high-resolution digital field camera from the office safe. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant, the sudden, quiet realization that some structural foundations do not fracture with a loud, cinematic explosion. Instead, they fail through a hidden, long-term compression of variables until one single, calculated event completely liquefies the underlying masonry. You do not counter a toxic, multi-generational matrix with an immediate, chaotic, screaming match. You counter it by switching off the emotional static and quietly assembling an unassailable archive of empirical facts before the other party even realizes their highly polished defensive script is completely obsolete. Under the clear, cold light of the northern window, I initialized the documentation process with absolute forensic precision. I captured exactly 11 high-resolution digital photographs. I positioned an industrial steel ruler perfectly parallel to the documented injury to provide an immutable dimensional scale for the permanent record. I recorded Maya's verbal account word for word on a lined legal pad, tracking every structural inflection, and logged the exact timestamp at 12:47 p.m. I deposited the severed 14-inch copper braid into a heavy-duty industrial-grade Ziploc bag and wrote the word evidence across the transparent plastic with a thick black marker. Bypassing the standard family channels entirely, I dialed the secure private line of Dr. Elena Marsh, a senior forensic pediatrician at the medical university. She had spent 7 years instructing my line on how to evaluate hidden trauma lines in complex domestic cases. She decoded the absolute flat register of my voice within less than a minute. "I am loading my forensic case kit into my vehicle, Gillian," she said through the receiver. "Maintain your baseline coordinates until I occupy the space." I sat alone on the bathroom floor, tiling, my leather briefcase locked tightly beside me, watching the headlights of her vehicle sweep across my dark driveway. The administrative machine was actively initializing, and no corporate family diplomacy would alter the trajectory, but I still had no way of knowing if my own husband was a conscious variable in their calculation. Isolation teaches you how to calculate the cost of entry. When you exit the state care system at 17 with a single canvas duffel bag and no ancestral directory to anchor your name, you develop a hyper-disciplined understanding of structural security. I constructed my independent solvency brick by single brick. I carried $82,000 in specialized graduate architectural restoration debt, worked the midnight intervals at the Charleston shipping docks, and liquidated every single penny of that liability entirely on my own signature. When I purchased our dependency cottage on Ridgewood Lane, the deed bore my name exclusively. The $84,000 down payment was derived solely from my personal structural savings. I owned the land and secured the masonry before I ever introduced a partner to the domestic layout. When Daniel Vane entered my life, He carried himself with a quiet, predictable deference that I mistook for absolute psychological autonomy. I failed to identify that he was merely a highly reliable maintenance node operating under the absolute command line of his mother, Kimberly. When Maya arrived, manifesting thick copper curls from some deep, unrecorded branch of my biological history, Kimberly evaluated her pigment under the hospital window and stated that she looked completely unmoored from their line. Yet, I chose to integrate my line into their matrix. I sat at the absolute periphery of her formal dining room every Sunday dinner, monitoring the reduction pots and retrieving the historical silver polish on command. I endured her clinical references to Maya as the redhead, spoken with the detached precision of an insurance appraiser, evaluating an anomalous feature on an estate property. I can admit now that part of me recognized the transactional nature of our alignment, long before the shears ever entered the frame. At the time, I chose to run a highly specific calculation sequence in my own head. I was entirely willing to tolerate the subtle social degradation of that folding chair by the kitchen service exit if it purchased a permanent historical directory, structured holiday traditions, and a multi-generational legacy for my child. I watched Kimberly execute her Thanksgiving place cards in handwritten calligraphy, where my card invariably read, "Gillian never, Gillian Vane." I kept that scratching script card locked in my desk drawer. We tell ourselves an extensive list of falsehoods when we are desperate for a sense of continuity. We asset map our relationships, trading small increments of our personal identity for the illusion of familial safety, entirely blind to the reality that a system, which requires you to sit by the service door, will eventually view your child as raw material to be edited for their public ledger. My 9 years of structured silence had not purchased real security. It had merely signaled to the Vane matrix that I was a compliant asset who would never enforce a boundary line. On Wednesday morning, while her curated public platform maintained its polished southern facade, I executed a forensic audit of the Vane generational archive. Because she had never revoked my administrative security tokens from an old consulting project, her back-end production folders labeled Content Drafts 2026 were fully accessible. The data exposed the exact financial parameters of her panic. A catastrophic 40% drop in platform engagement indices, a terminated organic revenue sponsorship, and an outstanding $24,000 digital infrastructure debt funded directly by Kimberly's estate. But the most critical piece of data appeared in the cache metadata log. Amber had manually deleted 6 specific image thumbnails of Maya's bleeding injury within exactly 4 minutes of the cut. She knew the precise nature of the damage before she ever deposited my child onto my driveway. I located the unedited, raw video file titled Heritage Cousin Episode 4 Render Final, timestamped Tuesday at 4:47 p.m. The media track documented the physical violation with absolute high-definition clarity. Amber had anchored Maya into a historical mahogany dining chair directly under her high-output light arrays, pulling her copper hair taut against the cranium and systematically hacking it away with long silver industrial shears while looking directly at an on-screen metrics counter. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant, the terrible trap of a cruel normalization. When an individual operates entirely within a corporate status framework, human boundaries cease to exist. A child's body is reduced to a performance asset, and an act of physical battery is hollowed out until it is viewed as a mere production adjustment to protect the visual symmetry of a brand. At exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds, the steel tip of the shears caught the skin superior to Maya's right ear. The child issued a sharp, high-frequency yelp of pain. Amber's hand experienced a sudden jerk away from the cranium, but her lifestyle voice track merely dropped into a flat, irritated register. "Oh, whoops! Hold completely still, Maya." "That is just a minor nick, sweetie. Don't ruin the frame." She had only aborted the global upload because the physical presence of human blood would violate her platform's commercial guidelines. Friction within a legacy system always triggers a defensive alignment. When Daniel returned from his conference in Dallas on Tuesday night, he did not immediately validate my legal timeline. He exhibited an intensive psychological resistance, caught entirely within his multi-generational conditioning to protect his maternal command line. He sat at the kitchen terminal with his head clamped in his open palms, staring at the screen record, yet he begged me to manage the situation internally. He argued that a public disclosure would destroy Amber's economic solvency and bring a catastrophic social invoice down on the Vane name. This wasn't a structural compromise I was willing to fund. Simultaneously, Amber mobilized her network, broadcasting a pre-formulated script across the family text lines that pathologized my response. She painted me as an unstable, volatile outsider trying to execute a malicious extortion campaign against a single mother over a family haircut error. Daniel looked up from the monitor, his respiration shallow, his jaw locked. The structural shift in his allegiance was slow, painful, and entirely incomplete. Institutional gears move at an unyielding, predictable velocity. On Wednesday morning at precisely 8 a.m., Dr. Elena Marsh routed the official forensic child trauma log directly into the state network under a Priority Child Protective Services Index. I simultaneously secured the services of Sarah Whitfield, a high-status family law litigator specializing in asset protection and multi-generational estate exploitation. Whitfield immediately bypassed standard domestic mediation channels, preparing an emergency protective injunction to strip Amber of all unsupervised access to Maya based on documented physical child abuse and the unauthorized commercial exploitation of a minor on a monetized platform. She explicitly notified my line that once the pediatric report registered within the state router, the bureaucratic loop was fully locked and could not be retracted by personal preference. It was a formal transfer of custody parameters to an external authority. Kimberly attempted to execute an immediate systemic interception. She issued an absolute command line for a mandatory family stabilization conference at her Maple Drive mansion during Wednesday dinner. The historical, bower-facing dining room was arranged with surgical, tactical precision, the country club silver perfectly polished, the elite catering assets laid out, and the extended family nodes aligned on the film-covered damask sofas like a well-drilled defense unit. They expected an emotional negotiation. Instead, I quietly deposited 3 identical copies of the clinical trauma sheets and the official state case index onto the center of the polished mahogany table, completely breaking the visual symmetry of her presentation. What stayed with me wasn't the sudden hostility in the room, it was the absolute precision with which the old money lifestyle veneer fractured. That was the moment I truly understood that a legacy-obsessed family system does not value internal harmony. It values the absolute enforcement of its own hierarchy. The exact minute your empirical data threatens the economic viability or public reputation of their primary asset, the facade of charity liquefies entirely, and the protectors of the line will willingly sacrifice a child's safety to preserve the structural integrity of their brand. Kimberly maintained a freezing, calculated venom, advancing directly into my physical perimeter. She wasn't processing grief, she was executing a desperate defense of her estate. She looked down at the forensic documents, her voice dropping into a low, threatening hiss. "You will drop this immediately, Gillian! You are an expendable outsider with no lineage, and we can strip you of everything you own before the weekends." I stood entirely motionless, mapping the physical fractures in her composure the identical way I evaluate a buckling brick wall. Her volume wasn't a manifestation of power, it was the exact high-frequency sound an overextended load-bearing partition makes right before the ceiling collapses. Daniel rose from his coordinate at the long table, stepping cleanly between his mother's frame and my briefcase, forcing an absolute halt to her advance. Historical records do not preserve manufactured lies. Thursday evening, inside the quiet confines of my office on St. Philip Street, I built a defensive vault against the custody intervention Kimberly's legal team threatened to launch. My daily work involves parsing county records, tracing public title deeds, and digging through decades of real estate registries to understand a building's true structural health. I directed that identical analytical lens toward the Vane estate history. I worked slowly, matching deed signatures and logging corporate shifts chronologically. Every transaction left a clear, ink-stained line of intent that no family gaslighting could erase. I pulled the historical land partition maps and corporate transfer logs for the Maple Drive property, scanning backward into the archive until I anchored my search in the fiscal year 1996. Tracing those fading signatures on the public plat maps forced me to confront a pattern I had spent years trying to minimize. Hidden beneath layers of corporate restructuring files from 3 decades ago lay an entirely redacted set of civil partition logs. They belonged to Kimberly's late younger sister, a talented, independent botanical illustrator whose physical and legal presence had been completely expunged from the family directory. The documentation demonstrated that Kimberly had deployed the exact same operational framework 30 years ago, a seamless sequence of passive-aggressive visual exclusion, the absolute denial of ancestral corporate capital, and systematic public allegations of emotional instability to strip her sister of her legal architectural share in the single house. Her non-conforming, uncurated lifestyle threatened the old money branding objectives Kimberly required to maintain status with local preservation boards. The sister was structurally displaced, dying in systemic isolation, while Kimberly secured sole administrative custody of the family diorama. I realized then that some families operate strictly as lifestyle corporations rather than emotional sanctuaries. Within those systems, the generation of conditional love requires a continuous, behind-the-scenes engineering process. Human nonconformity is systemically cut away, hidden under protective canvas covers, or entirely erased from the public record to maximize the commercial value of the lineage asset. This wasn't an accidental anomaly. It was a deeply socialized, multi-generational script. Amber and Kimberly were merely running an internalized program designed to physically modify or entirely mute any human node that created an aesthetic variance in their public social ledger. They were the highly socialized products of a curation machine that traded blood for social standing. I closed the heavy archive folder, the dust of 1996 settling onto my desk under the green banker's lamp. I looked out at the Charleston harbor lights, understanding that the family's entire public reputation was built upon a precise alignment of silent graves and erased daughters. The data was absolute, the timelines were clear, and the legal ownership parameters were locked into my files. The pink canvas bucket hat Maya carried home wasn't a spontaneous cover-up for a haircut error, it was the exact modern iteration of an ongoing ancestral editing process. I had precisely 48 hours before Amber's highly publicized corporate brand launch, disguised as her daughter Paige's birthday event, initialized, and I held the architectural blueprint of their destruction. Saturday afternoon arrived with an unyielding visual perfection. At exactly 2 p.m., the front lawn of the Maple Drive estate was fully populated by 52 selected guests from Charleston's elite social register and historical preservation societies. Pink and purple silk balloons were anchored to the historical iron fencing, and a massive calligraphed banner dominated the veranda. Amber's professional lighting rig and high-resolution camera setup occupied the prime coordinate directly adjacent to the catering array, actively transmitting the entire strategic event to her global digital audience. The red recording dot was pulsing steadily on the console. Daniel and I entered the perimeter with absolute physical containment, carrying no emotional static, only 3 identical copies of the forensic manila folder hidden flat within my briefcase structure. After the artisan pastry course concluded, Amber positioned the crowd on the brick patio to screen a highly filtered digital presentation titled Heritage Cousin Episode 4 Render Final. The video track looped staged footage of Paige and Maya in matching linen smocks, terminating on a brief 5-second preview of Maya anchored in the mahogany chair with the silver fabric shears entering the upper quadrant of the lens. As the crowd issued low murmurs of status approval, I stepped directly into the projection line, completely interrupting the light beam across the jasmine vines. Bypassing any uncoordinated shouting or physical volatility, I utilized my neutral professional voice to read the raw pediatric trauma metrics directly from Dr. Marsh's university letterhead. The most complete reversals of power do not require physical or verbal violence. They occur when you force a performative system to look at its own internal reflection through the unyielding lens of verified data. When the abuser's public stage is converted into an administrative record, The architecture of their control collapses under the weight of its own structural contradictions. I systematically distributed the certified pediatric trauma reports and photographic evidence down the rows of Church Altar Guild members and preservation directors. The physical texture of the glossy trauma logs passed seamlessly over fine crystal plates and half-consumed slices of birthday cake. When Amber panicked, her vocal tract hitting a chaotic frequency as she demanded the retrieval of her intellectual property, Daniel blocked her advance with absolute load-bearing parental authority. Kimberly lost her calculated composure entirely before her entire network. Stripped of her low-country veneer, she launched into an unmanaged public scream. "You were nothing before this family allocated you a folding chair! We took you in!" Her active live streaming device captured every single bite of her breakdown, broadcasting the raw moral collapse of the Vane family matrix in real time to over 30,000 live viewers and her primary corporate sponsors. Janet Pwitt, the senior leader of the Altar Guild, stood up from her coordinate near the boxwood hedge, looked at the steel ruler tracking the wound in the photograph, and broke the family's defensive script before the entire assembly. "Kimberly, I have verified the clinical light tags," her voice carried clearly across the silent turf. "This child was actively bleeding. This is not a domestic misunderstanding." I gathered the empty data folder from the patio table, pulled Daniel toward the gate casing, and left the 50 guests standing in absolute, frozen silence, while Amber's streaming monitor registered a rapid sequence of commercial cancellations. The resolution of our lives over the subsequent 6 months did not unfold with the rapid, artificial precision of a cinematic court drama. Real life operates through gradual, structural adjustments, and the decay of an overextended multi-generational matrix is a slow, bureaucratic process that takes time to finalize. Child Protective Services closed their formal case investigation with a permanent, active forensic warning entered directly against Amber's state administrative record. The family court judge subsequently granted our priority petition for a permanent protective injunction, legally banning Amber from executing any unmonitored proximity or custodial contact with Maya under penalty of immediate operational arrest. The platform known as the Organic Matriarch suffered an absolute, immediate financial liquidation. Within 48 hours of the lawn exposure, her primary corporate sponsor, Sage and Ivy, issued their public termination of alignment, forcing Amber to delete her entire cousin customization video archive and transition her global accounts into private stasis. The social invoice presented by the Charleston community was total. Kimberly's elite country club membership was quietly revoked. Her prestigious Altar Guild positions were permanently reallocated due to structural neighborhood alienation, and she eventually sold the ancestral single house on Maple Drive entirely, relocating to a lower status inland district to escape the permanent public record of her own actions. Daniel moved his physical belongings into the guest wing of our dependency cottage for exactly 1 week at my explicit request. We have subsequently initiated intensive marriage counseling with Dr. Reed, working together to deprogram the years of psychological conditioning imposed by his mother so he can finally learn to stand on his own. Maya's hair measures precisely 3 inches in structural length today. The new growth is emerging thick, coppery red, and incredibly dense. Yesterday afternoon, she stood in the accessories aisle of our local drugstore for exactly 11 linear minutes, testing the flexibility of various hair ties before selecting a bright blue ribbon entirely on her own authority. 11 minutes of a child exercising absolute unmonitored autonomy over her own physical identity. I timed the interval on my watch, anchored my frame to the perimeter of the aisle, and did not rush her timeline by a single second. The space we construct for ourselves after a total systemic severance requires an unyielding alignment with reality. I spent 26 years of my life operating old brick structures, believing that any family matrix, no matter how secondary or conditional your coordinates are, is a superior variable to an independent existence. I sat in that folding chair by the kitchen service door for 9 long years because I mistakenly assumed that visual submission was the mandatory invoice for human belonging. It is not. An authentic human belonging never requests you to hide your child's blood under a canvas hat to shield a lifestyle brand. And if the structure demands that sacrifice from your offspring, it was never a family ecosystem to begin with. It was simply a highly leveraged commercial project that required a completely silent audience to sustain the illusion of its own harmony. I have anchored my plumb line flat against the masonry, and my daughter is learning to navigate her own space under the sun. Have you ever sat at a table where the price of your seat was the systematic erasure of your own boundaries? Or have you found the structural courage to pack your duffel bag and walk away? If this story resonated with you, I would like to read your personal perspective in the comments below.